Okay, great. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I see a few people I know. Hi, Vivian from Arkansas. And I love some of the questions coming in, like, did you feel welcomed? So that's great. So I think we can go ahead and get started and go to the next slide here. All right, so good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the final webinar in the Center for Best Practices Summer 2025 Summer Webinar Series. Today, we're going to be talking about designing participant-centered non-congregate summer meals programs. I'm Holly Donovan, and I'm the Director of Program Innovation at No Kid Hungry. The Program Innovation team works across programs that No Kid Hungry supports, focusing on designing strategies that meet the needs of families experiencing economic insecurity and working to improve the user experience of federal nutrition programs. So regarding summer non-congregate meals, our team has a particular interest in understanding, designing, and sharing models and approaches of the non-congregate program that work best for families. And we can go ahead and go on to the next slide. So before we begin, a few important housekeeping items. The slide deck will be shared via email after the webinar, along with the recording and the resources that we share today. We are going to be interacting and engaging with you all via that chat box today. So when prompted, if you want to respond in the chat box, we would love that if you're comfortable. And then if you have questions for the speakers, please enter those into the Q&A box, which is a different box at the bottom there. And we'll try to answer those at the end of the session if we have time. And then we also have closed captioning available, so you can turn that on at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And now we can go to the next slide for our agenda for today. So the purpose of today's webinar is to think about how we might center the needs and desires of program participants in this program. Many of you joining today are program sponsors directly operating summer meal programs. Others of you might work in agencies or organizations supporting these programs in other ways. Everyone is juggling a lot as you're simultaneously operating these programs, figuring out what you want the program to be in your community, and managing staffing, budget, regulations, integrity plans, and more. So given that, we know that it can be difficult to find the time to engage and get feedback from those who are participating in our programs. To think about changes we could make to improve program participants' experiences with the programs, or to pause and imagine what this program could be for families and communities. So with today's webinar, we're hoping to carve out just a little bit of time for this kind of reflection, and also share some practical tips and tools that you might be able to use in your own communities to obtain participant feedback and incorporate it into your summer meal program. So for the agenda today, first, I'm going to briefly share some learnings from interviews and surveys with program participants. Then we're going to hear about a recent collaboration with Second Harvest of the Big Bend in Florida, where we co-designed program improvements with community members. And then finally, we're going to be sharing tips and tools for ways that you can get feedback from participants in your own community. Next slide. Before we get into the content, just a quick disclaimer. So our speakers represent their own experience with non-congregate summer meal programs in their states and localities. Certain program models and implementation methods might be restricted in some states, so just check with your local agency before implementing any new meal service model or implementation methods. Next slide. So today, I am very excited to be joined by these speakers, Lucy Flores, Samantha Daniels, and Melissa Hill. Lucy is a design strategist dedicated to advancing equity in the food system, and she is the founder of Studio Magic Hour. She has led design projects, facilitated workshops, and coached in-house design and innovation teams at organizations including the California Academy of Sciences, the Fair Food Network, Hope Lab, the Nature Conservancy, Plant Futures, No Kid Hungry, and Southern Poverty Law Center. She's a former Equitable Design Fellow at Hope Lab and a member of the Democracy and Belonging Forum at the Othering and Belonging Institute. Sam Daniels is the Director of Community Impact for Second Harvest of the Big Bend in Tallahassee, Florida. Sam's trained and assisted community organizations throughout the state in administering the Summer Food Service Program as a program specialist for the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And now at Second Harvest of the Big Bend, she leads a team coordinating the food bank's program and agency relations. And Melissa Hill is the Nutrition, Education, and Programs Manager at Second Harvest of the Big Bend. She leads Second Harvest children's programs and has played a key role in expanding summer meal access for kids across the region. And finally, I'm also joined by my colleagues Taylor and Robin, who are helping us out with all things technology and slides and Q&A today. So thank you all, and we can move on to the next slide, where Lucy is actually going to kick us off with a question.
All right. Hi, everyone. So before diving into what we have learned from surveys and interviews, we'd love to get a sense of where folks are at in terms of involving program participants in planning and design decisions. And we know you are all here today because you're interested in learning more, and we are curious about where your program is on that journey. So we are going to kick off a poll here that's going to show up in Zoom, and we're going to invite you to take about 10 or 15 seconds to answer the Zoom survey that should be popping up on your screen. And the question is, to what extent do you currently involve program participants, meaning caregivers and or kids and youth, in planning or design decisions? So it's not at all. Participants are not involved in planning. Rarely, which is we occasionally get participant feedback, but it doesn't shape the program. Sometimes participants contribute ideas, but we lead most planning decisions. Often, so participants are regularly consulted and influence key decisions, or always. Participants are deeply involved as co-creators or decision makers. So go ahead and take just another moment to look at the options and share which answer feels most aligned for you at the current place where your location, or excuse me, where your program is operating. All right, and when you're ready to share the results, we can go ahead and do that. All right, so it looks like most folks are between rarely and sometimes. So there's occasional opportunities to engage participants, caregivers, and or kids and youth, but it doesn't necessarily shape the program, or you sometimes do, but you as sponsors mostly lead the planning and decisions. And then we've got a few that are here sort of early on in that journey that are not involved in planning yet. And hopefully after this webinar, you'll have some opportunities to lean into that. And then some who do it often, which is great. So a lot to learn from each other, a lot to learn sort of where we're at in our own journey. And I think you'll find something for wherever you are today in the webinar. All right, and we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, and I'm going to kick it back to Holly.
Okay, so over the past couple of years, No Kid Hungry has conducted research to understand more about program participants' experiences with the non-congregate program. In the summer of 2023, the first official year of the program, we conducted site visits and interviews with 30 participants at 3 different sites, each operating a different model: grab and go, mobile meals, and delivery. And then in the fall of 2024, we conducted a survey of 832 participating and eligible families. So to begin, I'm going to share just a few key takeaways that we've heard from families through this research. You can move to the next slide. One of the most important things to know is that families value this program. Parents are widely satisfied with the program, and they express strong agreement that summer meals help children get enough to eat in the summer, and that summer meals help families stretch their food budgets. You can move to the next slide. And then in interviews, families shared the same. They expressed that summer meals ease their financial burden. So Jen, a grandmother in Arizona, says this. She says, "The food has been helpful. It has been very helpful. Without it, I'm actually getting teary-eyed. Without it, we wouldn't be able to feed them during the summer. Honestly, it's a huge help, and if they took it away, I don't know what we would do. I have a husband that's disabled and has been disabled for a year now, and we're raising grandchildren, and we just adopted our youngest grandson. I don't know how they are doing things, but it sure seems like groceries keep going up, but the food stamps don't change. And it just seems like it gets harder and harder to provide." So families rely on this program, and they rely on the work that you all are doing. We can move to the next slide. And they also have preferences about the program. So it's probably not surprising that families prefer multiple meals. Of the families surveyed, 40% of families received one meal a day, but 3/4 of families would prefer multiple days worth of meals for either pickup or delivery. They especially prefer 5 to 7 days worth of meals, but 2 to 4 was also preferable over one. In interviews, multiple meals emerged as one of the most valuable features of the program for families. It freed families from making multiple trips to a pickup location each week, which some participants said took them 30 minutes each way. And it also gave families more flexibility. So when families had multiple meals, it allowed for greater choice and therefore greater food consumption by their children. The availability of a variety of food items enabled caregivers to support their children's dietary and food preferences by sometimes swapping meals between siblings, especially if a child had a specific need or preference. So that flexibility ensured that a child didn't go without, which sometimes might happen at a congregate site when there's only one meal item available. You can go to the next slide. And then when asked about model preferences, families prefer delivery. In our survey of families, 74% of families not participating said they would be motivated to join if home delivery were an option. Next slide. In interviews at families at the site where delivery was available, families praised its convenience. And then in locations where it wasn't yet available, participants indicated that home delivery would be a huge help to their families. We found that home delivery can offer an equitable solution to families, regardless of constraints that would otherwise inhibit participation in summer meals, such as access to transportation, a disability, needing to work, or childcare responsibilities. For instance, one participant says, "I'm battling cancer, enduring pain throughout my body, and my daughter has Down syndrome, so having the lunches delivered to us is an absolute godsend." Another participant where delivery wasn't available said, "Delivery would be helpful. That would be immensely helpful. Saving money on gas driving out here. I live on the far side, so it's about a 25-minute drive each way." While delivery seems potentially game-changing for families, we also know that delivery can be logistically and financially difficult for sponsors, and it's not universally available to everyone. So we've been learning from those who have done it, and we've shared some best practices elsewhere. The feasibility of the model is something that our team's exploring, so you can probably hear more from us in the future about delivery. Next slide. It was heartening to hear that interactions with staff were one of the most highly ranked aspects of the program, with 91% of participants saying they were very or somewhat satisfied with interactions with staff. Likewise, in interviews, when staff were welcoming and kind, it made a huge difference to participants. Some said that they were nervous about participating, and the welcoming and kind staff were the reason that they decided to keep coming back. So Nancy in Georgia says, "They're very nice. Instead of somebody looking down at me for coming to get the meals." And Ms. Smith in Georgia says, "No one's looking at you the wrong way." Next slide. So we know that program integrity is important and that meal providers are balancing creating a positive user experience alongside ensuring that everything about their program is in compliance. It's also worth noting that 51% of families said they would feel less comfortable participating if there were more strict, burdensome, or stigmatizing integrity rules. And it's very possible that families might be more concerned about that now than they were when the survey was conducted at the end of last year. In interviews, we also learned from families that they feel shame when they inadvertently break rules that they didn't know about. So that just underscores the importance of communicating those program rules and details ahead of time to families. Many families also said that they would prefer communication like text messages and phone calls over flyers. So that's just important to think about the method that we're communicating with families with as well. Next slide. And then finally, participants expressed concerns about taking food from others who might need it more. This is a theme that we've heard across programs over the years. I'm sure it's a theme that you all have heard too. While we know that in some cases there are unfortunately limits on the number of families that can be served, in other cases, the more participation, the better it actually is for your program. So improved communication, highlighting the service's broader benefits, such as support for families, job creation for food service staff, and reimbursements for the school district, could reinforce the idea that participation ensures the community has access to this valuable resource. So in those cases, efforts can be made to dispel the misconception that their participation might limit access for others. And instead, we can think about how do we let the community know that greater participation oftentimes supports access for others by allowing this service continuation. Next slide. Okay, so before we transition to the next topic, we'd love for you to just share your thoughts about these research findings in the chat. Is there something from these research findings that you could apply to your program or already have? We'll take just a minute for those to come in. You can think a little bit while we kind of move on and also add along the way. So we can, for time's sake, go ahead and move on to the next slide. Oh, we have some coming in. Great. Okay, very good. So in addition to this more traditional research to understand participants' experiences with the program, we also undertook a different kind of project to learn more about the models and improvements that could meet program participants' wants and needs. So last summer, we partnered with Second Harvest of the Big Bend in Florida on a year-long human-centered design process. And human-centered design is essentially a method for generating and testing concepts that prioritizes the needs and experiences of end users. Lucy facilitated this process, and Sam and Melissa, with us from Second Harvest of the Big Bend today, were program partners. So Sam, could you tell us a little bit about this process?
Absolutely. Hey, everyone. Thanks for having me on today. And thank you, No Get Hungry, for partnering with us and Lucy on this project. So we started out the project by interviewing 12 participants, and we learned a lot about their experiences in the past year participating in the program and some of the things that they may want to see in the pilot this year. And so then we followed that by 2 co-design workshops where we had program participants and Second Harvest staff in there to discuss learnings from the interviews and just really narrow in on those concepts and models that or even improvements that we wanted to pilot in the summer 2024. And then when deciding which concepts to pilot, we really had to think about not only what the participants wanted, their ideas, but also what was feasible for our organization to undertake, given our own unique strengths and constraints.
Terrific. Thank you. So while an entire human-centered design process is not going to be reasonable for most of us to take on, the improvements that Second Harvest of the Big Bend tested this summer are ones that could actually be infused into many programs regardless of the model. Next slide. So Melissa, could you tell us about the first of the 3 improvements you tested this summer?
Yes, so the first improvement that we wanted to do was to pick sites based on neighbor input and community members. So we did this in our focus group sessions, and we did it by printing out a service area map for that particular county, just like the one you see in the PowerPoint. And in that focus group, neighbors were able to circle or highlight locations that they felt like would be good distributions throughout the summer. And they also were able to highlight locations that would be easier for neighbors to get to in terms of transportation as well. And they really came up with some great ideas that we hadn't even considered before, like parks. Several neighbors said that parks would be great because not only could they pick up meals, but they could also give their kids a chance to play and let out some energy. And we love that idea. Unfortunately, it didn't work in one of our counties due to a previous incident, so they wouldn't let us distribute food there. But we were able to go back to the other suggestions that they provided, and we used fire departments and community centers.
All right, you can move to the next slide. Thank you. And I'll add that by adding new community identified mobile meal sites to the programs in Gulf and Taylor counties, the program participation rates grew from over 8,000 meals in 2023 to over 22,000 meals served in summer 2024. So that growth reflects a 160% increase in participation, thanks in large part to the locations that were identified collaboratively by community members. And we were excited through that process about this particular approach, and are excited now to publicly share this tool that Sam and Melissa's team used to identify community-led mobile meal distribution sites. And the tool is called Route to Reach, and it's essentially a hands-on workshop tool designed for summer meal providers who want to identify mobile distribution sites with community members, not just for them. And that's through mapping, small group discussion, and a site prioritization exercise. And through that, participants can collaborate to highlight service gaps, to propose new locations, as they mentioned, and to assess impact and feasibility. And so the tool, which is linked in the chat, thank you, Holly, makes it easier to design routes that are practical, community informed, and more equity centered. And the tool itself comes with built-in guidance on things like accessibility, translations, and compensation, and it can be adjusted to identify all types of meal service sites, not just mobile. So that's a bit about the tool that's in the chat, and we'll also round out the total session with all the resources as well if you're not catching it there. Go ahead and move on to the next slide.
All right, so the second improvement we were able to make this past summer was activities for kids. In the interviews and in the co-creation sessions, program participants shared there's just not a lot to do in these counties. These are very rural counties. I think like Holly mentioned that someone said earlier, it can take 25 minutes to drive to somewhere where kids can play or do something. So we wanted to come up with some ideas together on how to make the summer meals more fun and more joyful for kids, focusing on activities for them, and especially activities that can be handed out and taken with them, especially in the non-congregate setting. Again, program participants had so many amazing ideas, as you can see on the screen. We were able to do a sticky note activity with them. We created a calendar for each week with all of their ideas and even throwing in some of our own. And each week has a theme and corresponding goodies and activities. So I'll give you some examples that we did. We did a water week. Of course, we're in Florida. It's hot. I think it's hot everywhere, honestly, now in the summer. So we did some water blasters for them, which the kids loved. We did a creative minds week where we did some coloring books and some crayons. Unplugged week, get those iPads out of their hands for maybe a week. We did some drawing tablets and some fidget toys, which we also enjoyed at the warehouse. And then we were able to, with our budget that we had at the end of the year, we were able to do a backpack full of school supplies. We were really blessed with this budget last year. And some graphing calculators for the children that it made sense to do that age. I did want to point out though, we don't always have a budget in the summer for things like this. So I think this is scalable to anybody's program. This year we're looking at utilizing local businesses and we're encouraging our sites to do the same, to reach out to local businesses and individuals to either donate items like books to hand out or toothbrushes, or other resources out in the community to try to get some activities like this as well.
Thanks, Sam. We can move on to the next slide. As Sam mentioned, participants brainstormed a really exciting breadth of activities and toys and educational materials that they thought their kids would be excited to find alongside meals. And the participants were also excited knowing that we were going to share out the ideas they generated to sponsors in other rural communities around the country, which is why we're really delighted to share a tool with you called the Kids Treasure Tracker, which can support you in providing weekly youth giveaways to fuel a summer of nourishment and also joy, right? Because food and connecting with community and being out there in the summer is also about fun and joy. And so this tool helps summer meal sponsors plan creative, ideally low-cost giveaways that boost joy, engagement, and participation. And Holly dropped that tool link in the chat. And that includes an idea bank that, again, was generated by participants of fun, often educational and wellness-focused items, plus a sample weekly plan and a customizable template that you can use and adjust for your own program. And it also offers some really practical tips for sourcing, for budgeting. As Sam mentioned, budgets can really vary or not exist at all, right? So we provide some tips on how to work with what you've got and how to tailor giveaways to different age groups. And ultimately, the idea here is that by weaving in moments of surprise and delight, that programs can make every meal pickup one that's memorable and meaningful for both kids and families. And we can move on to the next slide.
The last improvement that we wanted to do was to also make the caregivers and parents feel appreciated too throughout the summer. In Florida, we are approved at our rural non-congregate sites for parents and caregivers to pick up the meals without children being present. So we really just wanted them to know that we appreciated them taking times out of their busy schedules to come to the distribution and pick up the meals. So we wanted to get ideas from neighbors on how we could show that appreciation. Again, they came up with great ideas and we were able to implement a few of them. One of the ones that we implemented were words of affirmation. And this was done by having our volunteers pack the little notes into the meal kits that the parents would be picking up each week. And then the other one we did was we were able to provide gift cards the last week of the distribution at a few of our sites to the parents and guardians that picked up. So just like with the activities for the kids, we're trying to bring some joy back to the program and help reduce that stigma. We also wanted to provide that for the parents and caregivers. Next slide.
Yeah, as Melissa shared, we all know how essential it is to really meaningfully honor and appreciate caregivers, whether they're parents or guardians or other adults who care for kids, for the tremendous work that they do day in and day out. And as many community members told us, as some people have already mentioned here in the chat, receiving appreciation is also one way to help mitigate stigma associated with summer meal program participation. So Second Harvest of the Big Bend developed a caregiver appreciation calendar, which we're also excited to share with you all as a tool for broader use. And thanks, Holly, for dropping this in as well. This tool helps summer meal sponsors plan meaningful ways to really recognize and thank caregivers for their vital role in supporting kids' participation. And so the PDF that is linked in the chat includes an idea bank of thoughtful giveaways, again, generated by community members, community resources, and wellness gestures, plus, again, a sample and fillable planning template, along with some practical guidance for programs of all sizes. And we really do find that sharing appreciations directly with adult caregivers can build trust, it can deepen engagement, and it can really strengthen community ties. So that's one of the last tools that we developed in partnership with community members during this project, and something we'd love to ask, and I'll drop this in the chat as well, which is, what affirming message would you want to share with caregivers today? I'm going to drop this in the chat so you can see it. But would love to hear if you could share something with caregivers that you work with, or someone, maybe even someone you personally know. You're thinking about a particular caregiver, adult or person that you support or have engaged with. What would you want them to know if you could share words of affirmation today? You rock. Yes, you're doing a great job. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing those. You make a difference. Yeah, keep them coming. We'll transition in a moment, but I'll just pause briefly again to thank you for sharing this in this space. And it's exciting to think about the ways those messages can continue being shared throughout the summer. All right, we can transition to the next slide. Food insecurity is not a personal failure. Absolutely, 100%. You got this. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so we're going to transition in a moment to sharing another suite of resources, including 6 mindsets and 10 additional tools that you can use within your programs to engage participants in collaboration. But first, we do have another poll for you, another question to drop here into the Zoom, which is just to get a sense of how confident you feel engaging participants in planning or design decisions. Now, there is no right or wrong answer here at all. We just want to get a sense of how people are showing up today. So the question is, how confident do you feel engaging participants in planning or design decisions? Not at all confident, a little confident, somewhat confident, mostly confident, or very confident. Again, no right or wrong answer here. Take just a moment. And then when we've got a set of responses in here, we can go ahead and share the results with everyone. All right. So how are we feeling confidence-wise? Here we go. It's a mix. Okay, yeah, it looks pretty split. A little, somewhat, mostly, not at all. Thanks everyone for sharing so openly. Our hope is that the tools and resources we're going to talk about in the coming section can support you wherever you are at. We can go into the next slide. And I got one more question to drop in the chat that everyone is invited to share if you feel comfortable, which is, what barriers have you faced or would you anticipate facing when it comes to engaging participants in planning or design? It gives us a sense of what might be top of mind for you as you're thinking about expanding the types of engagement or opportunities for engagement that you already have, knowing that there are all different types of barriers that exist. So I'll give you a moment to drop those in the chat. Something I know that we have experienced in some of the programs we worked on are everything from budget to capacity, not understanding the guidelines required to be followed. Got it. Lack of response. Try to poll this year. We only received 8 responses. Staff capacity, budget. Okay. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So we are of the belief that it's a combination of things, right, that can support the engagement process, ranging from mindsets to tools, and then of course practice and building that community trust. So we really want to be able to provide some of those mindsets and tools here today that can support you in building the practice, knowing that if you have specific questions that you know you want to get other thoughts on, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. We're not going to get to the Q&A section likely until the very end, but feel free to drop any of the questions you have here as well. All right, lack of responses, budgets, etc. Okay, got it. Thanks everyone for sharing. Why don't we move into the next slide and we'll start with mindsets. Mindsets are our beliefs that guide how we approach work. And because how we work is just as important as what we produce, we want to talk about it. I'd say that how we work directly influences the relationships that we cultivate, right, with our team members, with our partners, with our program participants, as well as the outcomes of our work. So essentially the how of how we work is really important. And as I walk through these, we're going to talk about 5. I invite folks to try on these mindsets if some of them are new to you. I imagine many of you, if not all of you, are already working with these mindsets on the day-to-day. Others might feel newer to you. So these are really an invitation to try on what might feel new or different for you, and think about how you might see your work through these mindsets. So we can go ahead to the next slide. The first mindset is to center and prioritize interest holders closest to your work. And while this seems like it should be a given, right, it's not always how the cookie crumbles in program development and operations. Within our organizations and nonprofits, we don't always or aren't always able to invest in engaging stakeholders as collaborators for a number of reasons. Sometimes we feel like there are funding limitations, right, that make it tricky. That's very real. Sometimes we don't have the time or don't feel like we have the capacity. Maybe sometimes we're in organizations where some teams feel like we already have the answers and we know. And just to be honest, sometimes, funders end up getting their voices and desires prioritized in the work. So there's a number of reasons that this doesn't always get prioritized. And that can lead to providers operating off of assumptions, sometimes biases, and of course, those are not always accurate. So that's why this is the first mindset that I always like to explore. And moving on to the next slide, what this essentially means is developing programs in partnership with community members most impacted by the topic area we're working on, in particular, those who have historically been excluded or underrepresented in that work. And that means they have lived experience, right? Or the expertise that comes from having directly experienced something like participating in these programs, and including stakeholders as core team members when possible. And putting this mindset into action will help mitigate bias and assumptions and increase the possibility of meaningful learning, program design, and trust building. So that's the first mindset. And we can go to the next slide where we'll talk about considering history and context. And that is because every topic we work on has been and continues to be influenced by history and context, right? And when I say history, I am referring to the past events that have impacted and influenced your work. And when I say context, I'm referring to the interrelated conditions, which can be cultural, environmental, political, economic, agricultural, and those conditions in which the work exists. So examining history and context helps us to better understand the surrounding conditions within which our work exists and how that current situation came to be. So on the next slide, we'll talk briefly about what that looks like when put into action. It means learning history and context from multiple perspectives, in particular from marginalized and underrepresented communities who are most impacted by the work, which will help you to gain a deeper understanding of the work, to produce more effective solutions, and to better position you to facilitate a more equity-driven process. And that's because as individuals, we often learn about history and context from our limited perspective, right? History books do not typically provide multiple viewpoints, and we can only have so much perspective from our own education and lived experience. So we may not always know that a specific community or subset of community members has experienced harm when it comes to an area of food history, right? We don't know what we don't know. So we need to both prioritize learning and then consider, of course, how that information, how that learning will inform our actions moving forward. We can go on to the next slide where we will look at mindset number 3, which is to take time for self-reflection. And this might seem, again, pretty straightforward, but in dominant American work culture, we're really big on what we sometimes call like manufactured urgency, right? Which is the pressure to keep producing. And then, of course, in our work, in our day-to-day work within food access, there is a very, very real urgency. Community members really rely on our programs for nourishment, which means we sometimes move so quickly that we don't prioritize self-reflection. But I really believe that this mindset is about prioritizing self-reflection among the other priorities we have, rather than seeing it as a nice to have or an add-on, because it encourages us to take some time to reflect on assumptions that we may have in our work. And we can move on to the next slide to talk about what that means. And what it essentially means in practice is taking time to reflect on who we are as staff members and volunteers, the experiences that have shaped us, and how our positionality impacts the ways we engage with and make sense of this work in our communities and the programs we operate. And doing this helps us to build self-awareness, which allows us to better understand why we believe what we believe and why we do what we do. And that enables us ultimately to both leverage our personal strengths and mitigate potential biases in our work. All right, we can go on to the next slide, which is mindset 4, and that's to embrace new information and change. Design is an emergent process that's driven by learning. And even if you don't have the word design in your profession or in your title, if you're creating and managing programs and services and other experiences in food, you're designing. We're designing in this work. And when we create those offerings, we have opportunities to make them useful and effective and equitable. But it can be challenging when we feel pressure to stay the course that we set out at the beginning of a process, but we can't meaningfully serve others if we aren't adjusting our work based on new information and learning, right? So if we move on to the next slide, we can see that embracing new information and change means, as we learn from interest holders, like community members, actually incorporating that learning into the work. And sometimes that means we make tweaks to what we originally expected, and that's totally okay. Putting this mindset into action will ultimately inform more responsive and effective outcomes, which again is better than committing to a path that is less effective or perhaps even harmful. And then finally, and very importantly, the fifth mindset we're inviting everyone to try on is to be mindful of power imbalances. And these can show up in all sorts of ways. We can be cognizant of them, but we also might not always be aware, in particular when we are the ones in positions of power and privilege. So for example, with organizations like ours that provide others with essential services, that includes, services like funding, looking at philanthropic organizations as well in the food space. These organizations, we can often inherently operate in what is a power asymmetry, where one has more power than the other does in terms of resources. So in that situation, asking for feedback from people or organizations that benefit from our programs and services can put pressure on people to feel like they have to respond in a certain way in order to not risk losing those benefits. So it's really important as we go through this process to consider where power imbalances might exist and consider how you can reduce those in your work with community members and partners in particular. And on the next slide, you can note that when we say be mindful of power imbalances, what we mean is considering how they show up and influence us in our work and what we can do to mitigate those risks and how to share the power that we do have so that we can reduce potentially harmful impact of power asymmetries. All right. So those are the 5 mindsets that we wanted to share. On the next slide, you can see that list. I would love to just briefly pause here before moving into the final section of the webinar, which is to hear from a few of you, just in the chat. You don't have to put up your hands, but which mindset would you like to lean into more heading into this summer? I imagine that there are several of these we feel like we hold and that we spend a lot of time focused on. Is there any one that you're like, you know what, that's one I want to spend a little more time on or put a little more energy into heading into the summer? Number 3, take time for self-reflection. I was going to say the same thing, Stephanie. Sometimes that can be the first thing on the chopping block when things are busy. 1 and 3, 4, 2. Yeah, I hear that. Thanks everyone for sharing and being transparent about that. Yeah, there's a real mix here. All right, thank you. Okay, we'll move into the next slide. Now that we've taken a look at some mindsets that are important to put into action, we're going to explore some specific approaches or tools that you can use. And we know that programs have varying levels of capacity, of funding, and time, which is why we've developed essentially a smorgasbord of tools that you can consider using. And I'll share a brief snapshot of these, and we'll dive into 2 a little more deeply. So if we go on the next slide, the first on the list here is co-design. We actually talked about co-designing with participants for mobile meal sites earlier, so that one we mentioned, but that's just one option for engagement. The next 2 that are listed here are interview formats that some of you might have experience with, and Holly is going to drop in the tool. Thank you, you're already on it. That we have developed 2 interview tools that you are welcome to use. One is called Voices Before Summer, which is the pre-summer caregiver interview guide. And then there's Reflections After Summer, which is a post-summer caregiver interview guide. And both of these include an adaptable interview script, a selection of prompts to explore opportunities and challenges, as well as practical considerations for you as hosts to consider for accessibility, confidentiality, ethical facilitation, etc. So those are all in there for you when and if you want to take a look. And then on the next slide, we're going to talk about the last tool that we're going to share here, which is really 10 tools in one. And it is an opportunity to look at bite-size or snack-size feedback is what we're calling it. And this is gathering participant feedback throughout the summer. And if you look at this link, and I'm going to go ahead and drop it here. I think it might have the wrong name here, Holly, so I'm just going to drop it in there. And if that's not it, I will find it for you afterwards. This link includes 10 tools, and each of the 10 tools has a dashboard of sorts at the top outlining 3 pieces of information you might find valuable, which is first, level of effort. So help you get a sense of how much of a lift this method may be, considering things like staff or volunteer time needed. The second is financial cost. And the third are some thoughts on what types of sites each method may be best for. So we'll go into the next slide, and we're not gonna go deep into all of these, but I'm just gonna briefly name what these are, and you can find them in the tool. So the first is 5 different tools for engaging adult caregivers. The first is a text message survey, so using mobile technology to conduct text surveys with participants, which we find incredibly effective for being able to reach and connect with community members. There's Story Booth for caregivers, where you invite caregivers to share short feedback stories at site-based story booths. There's feedback for raffle tickets. This is the adult version, where you ask for feedback on specific questions in exchange for raffle tickets with great prizes. There's postcards inside meal packs, which is sending home a prepaid feedback postcard with requests for parents to share their input. And then an adult suggestion box, which is to build a suggestion box for caregivers to drop their ideas into at your site. So you can find more about those. But briefly, I'm going to go to the next slide and take us into postcards included in meal packets, which is a participant engagement tool that invites sponsors to slip a pre-stamped postcard into meal kits, inviting families to share their feedback or ideas on a specific prompt. And it's considered medium effort and mid-range financial investment, since it requires procuring some postcards, of course, purchasing postage, etc. And I want to briefly pause here just to invite Sam and Mel, who have thought about this before and seen it in action, to share maybe just briefly what you liked about the approach, and any challenges you might anticipate, and how to address those challenges if you were to implement this or have in the past.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So I love this approach. I think that we saw in our co-design, getting advice from parents or feedback from parents is some of the best feedback. They know their kids really well, and it tends to be pretty practical. Like, I think they understand that there's constraints in our programs, so you can usually scale it either way, I think, for them, and make them happy. Yeah, so I think parents are like some of the most important people to get feedback from.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Then we can go to the next slide, which is the snack size feedback tools for kids and youth. So we have 5 tools here as well. There's Draw Your Idea, which is inviting kids and youth to get creative and draw ideas based on specific opportunities for feedback. There is a story booth for kids, like the adult version, and it's a chance to invite kids and youth to share short feedback stories at site-based story booths. There's feedback for raffle tickets, which is similar to the adult version, except some awesome prizes that kids and youth will be excited about getting entered to potentially receive. There's a sticker voting station. If seeking feedback on choices and options that you already have in mind, you can set up a voting station for kiddos to vote on using stickers. And then a kid or youth suggestion box, which is to build a colorful suggestion box for kids and youth to drop their ideas into. And as with the other 5 ideas, if you go to the actual snack size feedback tool, there is a like a planning guide, materials needed, everything you need is right there to be able to do this. And before wrapping this up fully, we're going to go to the next slide and take a moment to pause on one of these 5 ideas, which is Draw Your Idea. And this is considered a small effort and low range financial investment, since it requires coordinating art supplies and staff or volunteer capacity to provide instruction to kids. I'm going to pause here briefly and invite Melissa to share why you like this approach, and any challenges you'd anticipate and how you would address that.
Yeah, so I love this idea. I think it gives you a chance to connect with kids and be able to communicate with them on a whole different level. My niece, who is 8 years old, actually participated in the summer feeding program in her area last summer. And I asked her if she liked the meals, and all I could get from her was no, not at all. So, like, verbally, that's all she could communicate with to me. But when I saw this tool from Lucy, I was like, I bet I could get more information from her with this. So I asked her to draw a picture of what she would rather see in the summer meal kits for next summer. And I honestly was blown away. She loves McDonald's, so I was expecting to get a little red Happy Meal box with a big M on it. But instead, I realized that what she craved all summer long was fresh produce. So at the top, there's 4 grapes, there's an apple, some cucumbers, a slice of cheese, and carrots and cauliflower. And I think this is because when she's at school, she's getting that in the lunchroom at the cafeteria. but throughout the summer, she doesn't have as much access to the fresh produce like she does throughout the school year. So it's really eye-opening, and we're going to try with our sites this summer because we're having to do shelf stable. So we're going to try to give our sites the fresh produce that they can give to families when they come and pick up the meals in addition to what they're getting. Some of the challenges with this activity would be for your rural non-congregate because they're usually not there picking up the meals. But I think you could like send a flyer home explaining the activity, and maybe they could bring it back at the next distribution. Or you could pair with your local community centers and libraries and let them know about this activity so that when families are there, maybe they could do the activity at the library or community center and we could pick it up at the end of summer.
Ooh, those are such good suggestions. Love that. Thank you for sharing. All right, we can move on to the next slide, which is Q&A. Holly, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, okay, so at this time we'll begin the Q&A portion of the call. So if you do have any questions for the speakers today, go ahead and put them in that Q&A box and we will try to get them answered. I don't see any in there yet, so we'll just take
I saw a
a
question
moment.
come through. I
Thank you.
can say it out
Yeah.
loud and take it. And I forgot to mention it, like with the parents, getting the parent feedback, the challenge that might be there. I'm sorry, I blanked on that question. So that with the postcards, like Lucy had on there, like it may be the higher budget to do that. But what you can do, and we've done through other programming, is do a survey at the site, or send a flyer home or get a QR code in there to get some surveys that way. We were able to do some surveys throughout our program last year. And that way we actually got a lot back. I think any compensation you can give anybody for their time is, even if it's just a popsicle or something cute, like a lollipop or something, if you can do gift cards, money, that's amazing. But I think anything is just welcome. But I saw a question put in the chat that was, when do you have these conversations? So when are we having these co-design sessions, which I think is a really great question. And I would say, and I can open it up to other people, I would say as early as possible. I think we do our training with our state agency in January, but like as soon as Christmas is over, the holidays are over, we're like, it's summer, and everybody's like, no, it's not. We're like, yes, it is. We're talking about summer now. So I think as early as possible, but also now, like you can do these now. It doesn't have to be something you implement right when the program starts. I know our program starts in like 2 weeks. It can be something you implement in the middle of the program. It can be at the end. It can be sprinkled throughout, or you can start them now for next year. I think it's really important to plan ahead with this. Like we'll be having some throughout this year, because we plan to expand next year. So we expanded a lot last year. We're not really expanding this year, but we want to expand next year. So we want to start having those conversations to figure out where we need to expand and how to be strategic about that, but also just how can we better the program next year as well as this year.
Thank you so much, Sam. That's great. Okay, type those questions in if you have them. We have maybe 1 more minute here. And also, as we're waiting on questions, if any of you want to type into the chat successful ways that you've gotten feedback from participants, or even better, ways that you've implemented feedback that you've gotten in your program and maybe made changes that was successful. Here we have a question. Someone says, does anyone have a sample menu they're willing to share? We are new to the program. This is great. I bet Robin has a response to that.
Yes,
Robin,
hi there. I would visit our Center for Best Practices page. We have a brand new menu resource that was just developed on multi-day menus, and within that that resource, you'll find links to some sample menus, along with some other great menu-related resources. So I'll put those links in the chat.
Terrific. Okay, let's go ahead. Oh, let's see if we can take one more. I have schools and satellite sites. I'll be implementing the summer feeding program in my state. The question is asked, how will you monitor a child not receiving 2 meals on that day? Oh, Robin, this seems like a good one for you as well.
Sorry, I was just looking up that resource. I'm gonna read this again.
Yeah.
My state question, how will you monitor a child not receiving 2 meals in that day? This is, we don't have there's no straightforward answer to this question. In a lot of states, this is really kind of left up to sponsor interpretation. So one integrity plan that will work in one state or in one region may not be appropriate for another. So in some places they use actual registration forms, and other places, very, very rural locations, that may not be necessary in the integrity plan. We've heard for some is the fact that they know everybody in town. So there's various ways of keeping track. Another popular method is, especially when you have summer school going on, is to cross-check those summer school rosters, along with signage and attestation statements that a lot of summer meal sponsors like to use to inform families of program rules, and that 1 meal or meal pack per student is permitted.
That's what we like. We like the self-certification because we don't want to have to police that.
Exactly. But definitely recommend communicate with your state agency and to find out what is going to work best for your specific situation.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide if we could. Okay, so be sure to visit our Center for Best Practices page for access to all webinar recordings, resources, and more. And then what you will find here are all of the resources and tools that Lucy shared today. So when we send out this recording and slide deck after the webinar, you can go to this slide to actually find all of those tools and resources. And then next slide. Feel free to also subscribe to our summertime snack newsletter. You can use the QR code here or go to our Center for Best Practices page. Each month, the newsletter contains quick links to resources, webinars, and more that can help enhance your summer meals program. Next slide. Your feedback on the webinar today is appreciated. So at the conclusion of the webinar, a 5-question survey will open in your browser window. If you have the time to complete it, we would appreciate that. We're always trying to improve the webinars and get you the resources and content that you need. And then finally, next slide. Thank you. Thank you for attending, all of you, very much, especially at a time when you are getting ready to kick off these programs. So we appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, and thank you so much to our speakers, Sam, Lucy, and Melissa today. Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.